In this lecture, we will be looking at individual differences and how they are assessed. This focuses on the applicants in the employment process. So we need to choose constructs of interest, choose assessments of those constructs, and choose the procedure. How do we combine information and select the right person? I'll be talking about the first two of these here. So if this is our profile of a person, we're looking at the individual differences and how strong each characteristic is. It's what everyone is different. It's what makes our world interesting. The things that make us different from each other are what we call individual differences. Some individual differences used in the employment setting are cognitive ability, physical ability, personality, interests, experiences, emotional tendencies, health history, knowledge, skills. I didn't list everything here, but I gave you a good idea of various possible constructs that we look at. I'm going to focus on the first four of these and mention a little bit about knowledge and skills as well. So cognitive ability refers to the differences in abilities in processing information. Sometimes people use the terms intelligence or IQ or mental ability. In general, we're talking about this various mental abilities. G is what we use to refer to a general mental ability. G is a strong predictive validity, has a strong predictive validity in relation to job performance. Of all the things that people have tried to study to predict performance, G has consistently come out as the strongest predictor. One meta-analysis concluded that G has a correlation of 0.51 with performance. Cognitive abilities can be looked at either in terms of that general cognitive ability or more specific cognitive abilities. We have such things as fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence, among others. Fluid intelligence is the ability to solve problems, to reason, and remember. It's relatively uninfluenced by experience and schooling. However, crystallized intelligence is knowledge and abilities acquired as the result of experience. This reflects our schooling, our cultural background, and is also influenced by that fluid intelligence. This difference is important because it helps us explain changes over the lifespan. G, as a general mental ability, is relatively stable over the lifespan, with relatively predictable declines as we reach about age 60. Now, each of the different subtypes of cognitive ability decrease as well. So how do we assess cognitive ability? We can use knowledge tests, and these get to the crystallized intelligence related to a particular area of knowledge. There are tests of G that produce a single score. One example of this is the Wonderlic Personnel Test, which has 50 questions and is taken in 12 minutes. So it's a very quick test. It asks questions to assess verbal, spatial, and math abilities. There are also tests of specific cognitive abilities. such as the Bennett test of mechanical comprehension, the various tests of spatial relations, clerical and perceptual accuracy, and tests of memory. Here's an example of a spatial relations test item used for firefighters. As you can imagine, a firefighter must have good spatial abilities in order to navigate a burning building. So in the above picture, this is one side of a factory. And the test asks, what is the corresponding backside? Now, I'm not sure why there is the yellow on C, as that is not the correct answer. As you can see, the chimney is in the same place in all of the pictures, on the outside of the buildings. But the three chimneys together, the shortest one, should also be on the outside. And there is only one option in which that occurs. Physical abilities. Physical abilities can be trained to some extent. Generally, individuals are competing against a benchmark rather than each other, so more isn't necessarily better. Some jobs are dependent upon physical ability, such as a firefighter or a dancer. Now, we do have some differences that exist in physical ability. Gender and age in particular. Older individuals tend to have less muscle, stamina, and flexibility. And women tend to have less muscle mass and lower levels of stamina than men. And men tend to have lower levels of flexibility than women. And as you can see, I discuss this in terms of tendencies because any one individual can be very high or very low on an ability. So I'm just talking about the group averages. To describe physical abilities, Hogan categorized physical ability into three broad categories: muscular strength, cardiovascular endurance, and movement quality. We can further break these down, as muscular strength can be broken down into muscular tension, muscular power, and muscular endurance. As you can imagine, it would depend on the job that we're hiring for, which particular areas of physical ability are of concern. We also have other physical abilities that include sensory abilities, such as vision and hearing. Pilots and drivers are asked to take vision tests. Anyone who is found to be colorblind by an assessment is automatically knocked out of the running to be a fighter pilot. We have psychomotor abilities that can also be assessed. These require coordination, dexterity, and reaction time. And these include such things as arm-hand steadiness, manual dexterity, finger dexterity, control precision, response orientation, and reaction time. ADA regulations prevent employers from asking about disabilities or requiring medical exams of applicants until after a job offer is given. So an employer cannot ask about disabilities related to these physical abilities prior to hiring. So in order to assess physical abilities, we have various different considerations. Most physically demanding jobs require combinations of various forms of physical abilities. So we need to be measuring all the forms that are relevant to the job. For physically demanding jobs, physical abilities correlate well with job performance, but show substantial gender differences. We need to make sure we are having the least negative impact on women as a group when we do our assessments and evaluations of physical abilities, when we use physical abilities as a selection tool. Using physical abilities for selection is most defendable when it's used to predict performance, as opposed to secondary criteria such as likelihood of injury. And in fact, several court cases, discrimination cases, have been because physical ability tests have been used as a way to measure the likelihood of injury rather than performance. With Armour Star meatpacking plant, physical abilities were used to measure future potential injuries, not job performance. So when failed applicants sued, they won because the selection procedure did not reflect what was necessary for the job, just what would help the company financially not take the risk of having to pay for injuries. So some of the example physical ability tests that firefighters would need to go through include the stairway climb, where a candidate wears fire protective clothing and air tank and carries 7 pieces of equipment up 3 flights of stairs, 1 piece at a time. Each piece of equipment weighs between 25 and 55 pounds. A hose pull, where the candidate wears an air tank, stands in one spot and pulls 50 feet of fire hose filled with water using a hand-over-hand technique. And the ladder pull. A candidate wears air tank and pulls a 16-foot ladder from the ladder bed of a fire truck, places it on the ground, picks it back up, and replaces it in the ladder bed. You can use this link to watch some of these physical ability tests. Personality. Personality is the typical pattern of behavior and thought for an individual when responding to various stimuli. Personality predicts general behavior, happiness, and work-related behavior, including performance, absenteeism, counterproductive work behaviors, and team effectiveness. One of our common ways of describing personality is using the Big Five, or the OCEAN model. This includes openness to experience, which is a curiosity or imaginative, independent, and creative person. Conscientiousness, which refers to responsibility, being prudent, persistent, planful, and achievement-oriented. Extroversion, which has to do with sociability, assertiveness, talkativeness, and ambitiousness and energetic. Agreeableness, which is described as having a good nature, being cooperative, trusting, likable, and friendly. And neuroticism, which is the opposite of emotional stability. Sometimes emotional stability is used as the label for this category. And this refers to being anxious, moody, frustrated, or on the emotional stability side, being calm, secure, and poised. To take a test of the Big Five personality, you can use this website here. And although there is a pay option to get your scores downloaded, you can do it for free if you just proceed without an account. You just won't be able to download your results. Go ahead and do this personality test and see what it comes up with for you. You'll get a sense of the kinds of questions that are asked for each of these different 5 categories. See if you can try to match the items with the ocean categories. See if you can match the items with the ocean categories. Some criticisms of the Big Five include that the Big Five can't possibly account for all of one's personality. There are some other factors I'll talk about in just a moment that aren't quite covered. There are other things that, if you combine different pieces of the Big Five, give you what is essentially other types of personality factors. The Big Five don't predict performance all that well. The best factor that predicts performance is conscientiousness, and this is at a correlation of about 0.3, which is about a medium correlation. So these constellations, as I discussed, some people argue that this could or should be used instead of scores on individual constructs. So for example, if someone is high in conscientiousness and agreeableness and low on neuroticism, this is a sign that they have higher integrity. So a potential solution in dealing with personality is to use specific predictors when predicting specific behaviors to try to get a better validity correlation. So for example, use virtue to predict employee theft. And likewise, if we're predicting more global behaviors, something broader, then we should use more general predictors, such as conscientiousness, to predict overall performance. So some of our personality measures that are not Big Five constructs include core self-evaluations. This is one's fundamental bottom-line assessment of their worth as an individual. It's a combination of self-oriented constructs that we've probably heard of before, such as self-esteem, self-efficacy, locus of control, and neuroticism. Achievement motivation, which is a tendency for someone to have a high need for success. They're a go-getter. They're always striving for something more. And hardiness, the extent to which individuals thrive under stress. This is a personality factor that has been of interest to people for a long time, especially in terms of looking at groups of people, in terms of looking at individuals who seem to persevere through conditions that other people just break down in. Overall, personality predicts behaviors at work reasonably well. Not super well, but reasonably well. The nice thing is, these are independent of cognitive ability. So it's a good factor to add in addition to cognitive ability. It's better at predicting what a person will do rather than what they can do. And autonomy is an important factor here. Autonomy meaning that people have the choice of what they will do in their behavior. If someone doesn't have a choice, then their personality tendencies won't come out. But if the situation allows for them to make decisions, then you will see more of that personality, and it will be a better predictor of what the person does, and therefore a better predictor of performance. Vocational interests are individuals' preferences towards certain types of activities. Most of the research in this area has occurred in vocational counseling rather than in IO. But it is related, and it's had an impact specifically and importantly on what's considered person-job and person-organization fit research. Vocational interests are better at predicting occupational decisions and job satisfaction rather than performance. One of the major models of vocational interests is Holland's RIASEC model. And this is used in the O-Net. Essentially, Holland has broken down vocational interests into 6 categories. And the initials RIASEC stand for each of those categories. So the first one is realistic. This is solving practical problems, work with hands, and tangible materials. So people who like to build or to do things with their hands are going to be high in this interest of realistic activities. Investigative. Using higher order cognition and reasoning to systematically observe and examine complex phenomena and solve abstract problems. Artistic. Allows self-expression through symbolic means such as art and music, rarely require adherence to rules and regulations. Social. Characterized by cooperative work and open communication, often while providing services. Enterprising. Achieving goals, often through specific projects that require decision-making, persuasion, and a focus on financial considerations. And the last category is conventional, which is working with data and details, often via a formal chain of command, while following preset guidelines and procedures. So with this, people are interested in activities that revolve around one or more of these categories. And this includes not just paid work, but volunteering, hobbies, sports. It's the kind of activities that people like to do. People who work in an environment similar to their personality type are more likely to be successful and satisfied. And when I say personality here, I'm referring to these vocational interests. For example, artistic people are more likely to be successful and satisfied if they choose a job in an artistic environment. So this is often demonstrated graphically in terms of a hexagon. And like I said, people who choose work in an environment similar to their vocational personality type are more likely to be satisfied. And here are some jobs that would go along with each of these categories. Realistic jobs include things like carpenter, farmer, mechanic. Investigative would be a scientist or a psychologist. Artistic, a writer, musician, or actor. Social, a nurse, a social worker, or a counselor. Enterprising, a small business owner or stockbroker. And conventional, an accountant or librarian. So in order to assess these vocational interests, there are various vocational interest inventories. The top one here is through Holland's self-directed search. And this does require paying for it. I believe it's $10 to take the test and get your results, which you can do online. The other option is to use mynextmove.org, which is through the O-Net website. And this is free. It's probably less extensive than Holland's search. In both of these, you'll get scores on all 6 dimensions. and you will get possible jobs that match up to your interest profile. So let's talk about knowledge for a moment. Knowledge is the information in your head. You've acquired this through education, training, or experiences. There are a couple types of job-related knowledge. These can be broken down into declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge. Declarative knowledge is having the understanding of how to do a task. That is, knowing what to do. Procedural knowledge, on the other hand, is actual familiarity with the process, being able to do the task, knowing how to do it. To think of the example of a diver. A coach who has not dived, a coach may know what to do and be able to describe to an athlete what they should be doing. The diver, him or herself, will know how to do it, will have the feel of how it feels to go through the process of doing a dive, and may or may not know the right way or an effective way to describe how to do it. So in order to use knowledge as a predictor of performance, it must be shown to be job relevant, just as any other predictor would need to be. Now, skills are a little bit different. Skills are practiced acts or competencies. For example, typing, programming, playing an instrument. These are all things you've done through practicing the actual act of doing it. And again, if this is going to be used as a predictor, it must be shown to be job relevant. Emotions. I want to talk briefly also about emotional intelligence. This is the ability to recognize and attend to emotions in yourself and others, to determine the best appropriate emotional expression, and to regulate the display of your own emotions. This is very popular in general business writings these days. Particularly Goleman has given a lot of press to this idea of emotional intelligence. It is very similar to what has been known as social intelligence. It's not very well supported scientifically, particularly in terms of whether it even adds something to the study of individual differences. If we already have something, social intelligence, that gets to the same idea, is it important to recognize this as an additional factor? However, there are many people who support it, and it certainly has gotten a lot of attention and has a lot of face validity in the idea that being able to know the appropriate way to respond emotionally to people is an important factor in the workplace. So there are various types of assessments, and the form of an assessment can have different content within it. We have biodata, reference letters or references, tests, work samples, assessment centers, and interviews. Your book does a good job of covering all of these various types of assessments. So make sure to read all that and get a good sense of what the strengths and weaknesses are of the various assessment types. So tests are quantifiable and standardized procedures for measuring a psychological construct, using a sample of behavior or reported behavior. A test battery, on the other hand, is a collection of tests, generally taken together. And standardized tests, things like the SAT, ACT, GRE, etc., are tests in which the scores have been standardized across people. So generally, the scores come across as a percentile. There are debates, and there will continue to be debates, about the effectiveness and fairness of standardized tests. I would be surprised if you haven't heard about situations in which people feel the standardized test questions have been culturally bound, that they are biased against a certain group of people because they have not been familiar with the context or the content of what is used in questions. Though over time, the test makers have tried to get more and more away from anything that is culturally specific or would be biased against any group. Many of these tests have been put into computerized form, which are now in a form that allows the computer to adjust the difficulty of the test questions to come to a good conclusion of the ability level of the person taking the test. This is what's known as computer adaptive testing. I mentioned a couple other different ways of describing tests. We have speed tests, which try to get people to answer questions quickly. There's a rigid deadline. Most test takers won't finish the test, all the test questions. They're typically relatively easy questions, but it's the speed that's the important piece. And in order to use these, we need to show that speed itself is a job-relevant characteristic. And as you might imagine, there are ADA concerns about this. So again, it must be shown to be job relevant. If you want to take a look at a humorous example of speed tests, you can look at this link here. Power tests are kind of the flip side of that. These are tests that have more difficult items, and there's enough time given that most people can finish. So we also have group tests and individual tests. Group tests can be given in groups of people where scores are given to the individuals, but it's taken in a group setting. These tend to be time, effort, and resource effective since we have one monitor to monitor multiple people at a time. And some examples of that are the cognitive ability online tests. Individual tests are tests in which often there needs to be an individual watching or monitoring the test taker individually. They're effective when assessing process, not just the product. And they're good for establishing rapport. These would include things such as interviews and tests of hand-eye coordination. So some testing issues you should know about. Bias and culture. Bias is a statistical term used when a test systematically over or under predicts for a given subgroup. So for example, we can look here. And if a test underpredicts job performance for women, or predicts that they will score lower on job performance than they actually do, and overpredicts the job performance of men. So here you can see that men are predicted to have a higher score, but in actuality, they have a score lower than that. So this would be a biased test. Males would come out of the assessment looking better, but when they get on the job, males and females are going to perform about the same. Now, culture is a system in which individuals share meaning and common ways of viewing events and objects. In relation to testing, it's the extent to which the test taker has had an opportunity to become familiar with the subject matter or process required by an item. Here would be affected by culture. So grandma might not know what fishing is because of culture, or great-grandma. So it's probably not a fair item. So test makers tried to get away from culturally influenced items. One of the ways to do that is something like this. This is an example from the Raven's progressive matrices, in which people need to determine what the pattern is and pick the next item. Pick the correct item that would follow in the pattern. Is this a biased question? Jimmy is composing a song. His song is in 4/4 time, and he needs to finish the last bar. He currently has 2 whole notes and 1 half note in the bar. What notes could he use to finish the bar? So students who don't know music would have a harder time answering this question, as they don't know what they're supposed to add up to.